Muted.
Go Main Street, and we're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar today. Did want to let everybody know we are recording today's session, and so that for those individuals who wanted to attend and can't be with us today, we will send a link later this week that provides information on how to access the recorded session. A little bit about today's webinar. For those of you who do not, I am an organization program associate with New Mexico Main Street. Daniel Gutierrez is here with me. He is the assistant director for New Mexico Main Street, and Ana Blythe, the communication specialist. Want to say hello?
Hello all, and we appreciate you attending.
Welcome all.
So we'll go ahead and proceed. I did want to give you, I'll give you a little bit of information about the webinar interface here shortly, but wanted to just let you know an overview of today's session, an introduction to the Main Street economic development approach, and particularly how it relates to the asset-based economic development principles. We will also spend a few minutes contrasting the E-based economic development versus the asset-based economic development strategies. I'll go into a little bit deeper an overview of the asset-based economic development approach, and then how the Main Street 4 Points approach connects to economic development strategies. I did want to say that this is the first of a three-part series on the asset-based economic development piece. The second webinar will be in September. Amy Barnhart will present that one, and I'll give you a little bit of details on that one later. And then the third one will be presenting on economic development strategies in October. So a little bit about today's webinar. I'm going to provide a 20-minute presentation in audio-only mode, and that means those of you who are listening right now are not able to speak back to the presenters at this point, and we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. You'll notice to the right of your screen you have a control panel. These are for your interface on the webinar controls. If it's in the way of the actual presentation itself, you can use that little orange arrow at the left and click on that, and it'll minimize your presentation, your control panel. You can listen either on your computer device or your iPad if you're using an iPad, or by calling into the conference number, and there is a pin there. And then as we move through the presentation, if you have questions, there is a question and answer box, a question box located in your control panel. Do us a favor, just type in your questions as something comes up, and then we will address those at the end of the presentation. And so part of what we will also do is that we will include that in the recording for later viewing, as well as type that up and send that out with our responses. I do want to say as well, before I move on from this page, this screen, is that in the control panel there is a section that says handouts, and if you click on that section, you will actually see a copy, a link to the presentation itself with the note spaces in it, and so you can actually go to that link that says handouts, click on the link, and then download the presentation. I'll go ahead and proceed. I'll start with a little bit, for those of you who are less familiar with Main Street or haven't had a whole lot of history with it, a little bit of background on the Main Street, the history of Main Street. Historically, our Main Streets in our downtown district were the primary commercial hubs in American communities, and this really dates back to prior to World War II. After urbanization and marketplace changes, created a movement away from the downtown commercial centers. So we saw not only people moving outside of the downtown areas and the cores of the community into the suburbs, but we saw businesses follow them from the downtown into those areas as well, right? After World War II, changes in the local and federal policies affected how historic buildings were managed and maintained. So Main Street started really at the national level, was initiated through the National Trust for Historic Preservation as a movement to preserve the historical assets while rebuilding our economies in the downtown communities. So National Main Street Center really came online in the early 1970s. And for most of you who were with us last week in Artesia, you know that New Mexico Main Street came on board now 30 years ago. So what exactly is Main Street itself? Well, at its core, it's about real people doing real work to revitalize the economies and preserve the character of their downtown districts. So specifically, it's a proven strategy for revitalization. And we'll talk a little bit here shortly about the MainStreet 4 Points approach. Main Street is also a powerful network of communities, of linked communities, not only here in New Mexico, but around the country. Now in 42 states, in almost just over 2,000 Main Street communities nationally. Main Street is also a national support program that leads the field. I mentioned earlier the National Main Street Center, and they authorize the state coordinating body which resides here in New Mexico in the Economic Development Department, i.e. the New Mexico Main Street Program. Most importantly, Main Street is an asset-based community economic development approach to restoring the thriving economies in our downtown communities in this state. Right? So I want to keep that in mind, the economic development focus. Historically, the Main Street 4 Points approach focused on 4 areas. This was a strategy to revitalize your downtown district. Design, promotions, now what was originally known at the national level as economic restructuring, we used to call it here in New Mexico economic positioning, and now we are aligned with the National Main Street Center's new term, economic vitality. The 4th point being organization. The design piece is really about enhancing the physical elements of the district while capitalizing on the historic assets. There's a whole lot of pieces that involve the design point: urban planning, public art, historic preservation, adaptive reuse of buildings, placemaking projects, streetscapes, beautification. Those are all considered the design piece. Under promotions is really about positioning the district as the center of the community and the hub of economic activity by creating that positive image that showcases your downtown's unique characteristics. And so it really is about getting people back into your commercial district. Economic vitality point is really about harnessing the local economic opportunity and creating a business environment, a supportive business environment for business owners, entrepreneurs, innovators, and it includes things like business development, business recruitment, live, work, housing, etc. The 4th point is really, the organization point is really ensuring that all organizational resources, your partners, your financial resources, your volunteers, are mobilized to effectively implement a community transformation vision around using the 4 Points approach. A little bit about the Main Street economic impact in New Mexico. So this is a 3-year aggregate from 2013 to 2015 across the 28 Main Street communities. If you look at the impact, 335 net new businesses, almost 450 new building rehabilitations, $127 million inside the Main Street districts of new building construction, more than $60 million of public and private sector reinvestment in our downtown districts, our Main Street districts, over 1,600 new jobs created in the downtown district, and over 100,000 volunteer hours, which really amounts to about $2 million of leverage funds over the last 3 years. Right? A little bit about, let's contrast a little bit the E-based economy versus asset-based economy. You probably heard the E-based economic development terms quite a bit. This is often termed as classic economic development, and so it focuses on larger scale approaches, large scale economic development, looks at things like infrastructure for manufacturing, for transportation, for construction, often recruits external businesses to set up large scale operations and therefore large scale job development. E-based economic development leverages public funds for incentives such as tax abatements, job training funds, and then infrastructure development as well. A little bit of difference between the Main Street approach, which focuses on asset-based economic development. Asset-based economic development focuses on a bottom-up approach a community-driven approach to economic development, enhances the small business core of a community, focuses on retail, hospitality services, entrepreneurism, etc. Really builds off of your local assets in your district or in your community that are unique. So what are the arts, the culture, the agriculture that are unique to your community? And this would be very different in a community, say, like Clayton or Farmington compared to Taos or Las Cruces. So the asset-based approach is really a little bit more about a place-based economic development as well. Asset-based economic development leverages local investments, public and private, for economic projects in your downtown district. This is not to say that one is better than the other. Both E-based and asset-based economic developments are necessary for a strong economy. The Main Street approach focuses on the asset-based economic development. So I'm going to explore that one just a little bit further. Asset-based economic development is based on the principles of appreciating and mobilizing the community's talent, skills, and assets, and including the culture and the physical assets of your community. And it's community-driven development rather than developed by external or driven by external agencies, i.e. and your state government, your EDCs, et cetera. So it's a little bit different approach and who's involved in the process. In asset-based economic development, the focus is on creating and enhancing community treasures. Change is achieved by building relationships and partnerships with those in the community. In asset-based economic development, individuals in the community are seen as owners and producers of the work, not just the customers. And then your assets are represented by buildings, history, culture, the people, the policymakers, your previous plans that already exist in your downtown. In the second webinar of this series, Amy will talk a little bit more about asset mobilizing and asset mapping. And just remember that in asset-based economic development, asset mobilization is an action step that requires organizing and harnessing the relationships that exist within the community, which ought to give you, at this point, a little bit of an indication of what our expectations are of our local Main Street programs. 5 keys to asset-based economic development. First of all, the appreciative inquiry. You have to identify, analyze, and really understand the community's past success so that they become a platform that you build off of, right? Asset-based economic development focuses on building social capital, so the power of leveraging associations and both formal and informal linkages within the community to drive your economic development goals. And then the other 3 points, participatory approaches, collaboration, and civic engagement, really speaks to the Main Street work and how you drive your economic development in your downtown. So you build empowerment and ownership in the community by engaging them. You establish collaborations and partnerships to drive what you want to see in your specific downtown or your community, right? And you'll notice the photo at the right. This is actually an article from the Journal last month, which really focused on how economic development moves the agenda of success through a collaborative and a cooperative process. And so they use the Innovate ABQ as an example. But this really speaks to the heart of what asset-based economic development approach is the individuals, partners cooperating to drive economic development and economic vitality in your district. Right? So what's the role of our 28 Main Street communities, our 9 arts and cultural districts? First of all, Main Street programs locally in the Main Street community serve as a central structure with dedicated staff to lead the revitalization. Remember, I talked about the cooperative piece, the civic engagement piece. This is an area where your Main Street communities really become a focal point in engaging the community about what you want to see in your downtown district. Right? The local Main Street affiliates also create the processes and the structures that lead to common economic development goals, and again, within the confines of your downtown district. You assume responsibility for shared performance on economic development projects via the 4 points approach, and I will talk a little bit more later in the presentation about the New Mexico Main Street's focus and the National Main Street Center's focus on economic development indicators going forward. Right? Part of your role is to maintain continuous communication with your stakeholders, whether they be government agencies, economic development partners, or just the residents that have a stake in your downtown. Right? You should constantly be supporting the participants of your revitalization work and provide activities to build incremental successes. And I can't emphasize the importance of this one enough. It's good to have big, long-term vision, but the only way to really move is through incremental successes in your work. Last one is that the role of the affiliate, you implement economic development goals and strategies and monitor the economic development. Remember that in New Mexico, Main Street resides and implemented through the Economic Development Department, and so quite a bit of focus on economic development goals and strategies and your outcomes in your districts, right? Those last month at the, or last week I should say, at the quarterly meeting in Artesia, we presented a little bit of information at the business meeting. We presented information. Kathy LaPlante also provided some information from the National Main Street Center's 4-point refresh. Really focuses on a renewed focus on economic development goals as part of the Main Street work. So the expectation is that that's driven by a community transformation vision. And where does that usually come into place? For most communities, the vision is actually being driven and derived from your downtown master plan, right? And so those of you who have moved beyond the startup phase and have a master plan, that really represents the focus of your transformation vision. At that point, all of the organizations really should be developing economic development goals, probably 2, 3, or 4 each year from that. And I'll talk a little bit here shortly about what that means for you and what information and services we have to help you with that process. And then each of your Main Street 4 Points projects really should support the implementation or the realization of those 3 or 4 economic development strategies each year. So what does this mean for you? It means that, you know, over the next year as we phase this in from New Mexico Main Street and move the work forward, you will see an elevated focus on asking the communities to really develop, identify, and relay their economic development goals and strategies, and then to start to look at how their activities, their budgets, their funding, and their metrics really support the outcomes of those as well. So, and I think Kathy had a great presentation on that. You'll see the National Main Street Center roll out their communications in October around this work. New Mexico was the first one to really get the communications, and thanks to Kathy for joining us last week and giving us an advanced look at that. So just to relay that, what that looks like for you. We have an example here, and Keith will present in the third webinar a deeper exploration of what this looks like. But let's just say that one of your strategies is to capture more local consumer dollars by helping existing businesses to better serve the local residents. Well, how do you know when you're there? Well, you can measure that through increases in your sales in the district, gross receipts, taxes, car and pedestrian traffic, and then attendance at key events. If you look down at the table at the bottom, this is really how we would expect you to start aligning your work and your work plans to really achieve that specific strategy. So, for example, if you want to capture more local consumer dollars, your economic vitality work might be to distribute market profile sheets, produce a business enhancement seminar, and provide in-store consulting. From the organization side, you might want to think about developing a local business asset map, and Amy will talk a little bit more about the asset maps in the second webinar, to guide your work. Start building those relationships with your local city or county tax assessors. Maybe they can help you with compiling some of the sales of the GRT information. Conduct some business visitations so that you start to engage the local business owners in shop local or network recruiting events, and maybe look for 10 or 15 sponsors for those shop local events. Also under organization, establish a PR campaign highlighting your business development goals. Under design, how do you get more people to spend more money in your downtown district if they're from your community? Maybe create a tactical urbanism project in an empty lot. You add some seating, shading, public art. Create a TIF district to establish a sustainable funding source for street and public area improvements. And maybe conduct a facade squad and get some people from your downtown, take pride in their community and their district, paint some walls, refresh the planters, repair the decks, and really start to spruce up the area. From the promotion side, produce an annual promotions advertising package that's targeting the local residents. Update the website directory maybe so that people have a better awareness from your website of what they can access in their local downtown district. And maybe implement a retail event or a sidewalk sale with some shared coupon advertising, etc., that's really marketed directly towards your local residents. So now you'll see an example how projects in each of the 4 points can drive the realization of that strategy that's listed at the top of this page. One other thing that I did want to point out, and so your asset-based economic development approach also extends to New Mexico Arts and Cultural Districts and Frontier Community Projects. Both also run coordinated through the New Mexico Main Street program. It's important to remember that the ACDs coordinated in partnership with New Mexico Arts and the Historic Preservation Division, as well as all the projects of Main Street and the Frontier Community Approach. So the ACDs are also community economic development initiatives as well, and they focus on enhancing the creative or the cultural economy in your district by positioning arts and culture as the center of the revitalization process. Right? Frontier Communities Initiative focuses on community economic development support in rural communities of less than 7,500 residents, and really to develop a single catalytic economic development project in those communities. It's intended to be a short-term support through New Mexico Main Street, 12 to 18 months, compared to what Main Street and Arts and Cultural Districts get, a much longer longitudinal support from the state in their economic revitalization process. Like Main Street, both the ACDs and the Frontier Community Initiatives must demonstrate a positive economic impact in job creation, business development, business creation, leveraging private sector reinvestment, and enhancing the community's economic environment. So I just wanted to reiterate that it's not just Main Street that focuses on asset-based economic development, but also the Arts and Cultural District and the Frontier Community Initiative. And so just to give a further example of that for Arts and Cultural Districts, we have 4 points under the Main Street approach. We have a very similar 4 points, different language for Arts and Cultural Districts. So what was considered design, the design point under the Main Street approach is called physical planning and development under the Arts and Cultural District. So very similar work, very similar 4 points, but really the revitalization focuses on the cultural and the creative economy. We do have many of our arts and cultural districts. I think Gallup is a good example right now of where the Main Street and the Arts and Cultural District 4 points are really being integrated together into all of their work together. So I think I'll close with that. We wanted to give today's session, have it be an introduction to the Main Street 4 point work and the new framing and the new language that's coming out of the National Main Street Center. For New Mexico Main Street, and I discussed a little bit about this last week at the business meeting and at the roundtables on Friday, it means that we have put together a task force to look at our entire service delivery, our educational pieces, our technical assistance, our assessment visits. We're going to start that process. We start our assessments with Main Street communities and arts and cultural districts next month. And so we're going to be asking you all for some feedback on what that looks like, how it should be implemented, and then how that's going to roll out in alignment with the National Main Street Center's 4-point refresh process over the next 12 to 18 months. I will say that there is a renewed focus on the economic development performance piece. That is nothing new, something that we have been working on for quite some time now, but it does mean that over the next year we will be phasing in how we support our communities and what we ask of them to report around economic development performance goals. There are 2-3 other webinars coming up that I do want to put in a plug for. Today's session was meant to be an introduction to the framing and the language. In September, Amy will really provide an exploration around asset mapping and asset mobilization. And then Keith is really going to explore in October the economic development strategies and he's going to provide a number of examples. I provided one example here and how that plays out. I am also providing a webinar on September 4th for the Main Street communities to really provide an overview of the annual site visits, annual performance review process. The team is comprised of Rich Williams, Daniel Gutierrez, Amy Barnhart, myself, and so we will be in your community starting in September and October, and then again in January and February to do the annual performance review. So we will close the webinar at this point. I will close the webinar. I do not see any questions in the question box, but I'm going to look at you can see if anybody has raised their hand. You see no hands raised, and so at this point I'm going to turn it over to Anna and Daniel if you have any closing comments.
All right. Well, thank you all, and again, don't hesitate if you want to raise your hand to ask questions during this session. If not, as mentioned, if you had questions at a later point, we would certainly get back to you based on what today's presentation. As Eduardo Martinez mentioned, this is the first in a series of upcoming webinars, so join us again September 4th, as well as September 17th or 15th. We will again send out the links so that you can register and sign up for each webinar as they come up. So thanks again for participating.
And I just want to close with one, thanking you all for attending. And if you have any feedback, we are rolling these out as a new way to try to communicate, especially board members who aren't normally able to attend our quarterly trainings or our institutes. So please do connect with Anna. I think she's the one that sent the initial notices, and she will be sending them out, updating people when the webinars are going to be available and how to sign up. So please do connect with her about any feedback or any issues that you may have experienced on your side, so that we can make these even better and even suggest future content in terms of what you would like to see coming out from us, especially for board members, like I said, who aren't able to attend some of the other trainings. So thanks a lot, and I guess it's the last call for questions.
See no questions. I will say this before we close it out. If you do think, I understand that I think some of the language and some of the next work that we have together may create some questions down the road, or maybe even some confusion. If you have questions that come up after today's session, please feel free to send an email to Anna and I, and we'll create a list of those questions and send those out to the participants as well. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of the week.
Thank you.
Thank you.